Hello to everyone listening from around the world. Before James continues his account, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today. If this story sounds familiar, if something like this has happened in your own family, share it below. This community was built for exactly that. Now, here is James's account.
The irony is that my son-in-law was the one who told me to get a home security system. He'd come over for dinner the previous March, sitting at my kitchen table in the Irvington house, eating the pot roast my wife Sandra had made, drinking the wine I'd opened. And he'd leaned back in his chair and said very casually that the break-ins on the northeast side of Portland had been climbing, that a man our age, living in a house this size, ought to have cameras. Front door, back door, garage. Peace of mind, he said. His name was Derek, 37 years old, my daughter's husband of 4 years. A mortgage broker who wore good shoes and always remembered to ask about my golf handicap, even though I hadn't played golf since 2019. I installed the system 2 weeks later. 4 cameras, cloud storage, motion activated. I used the installer Derek recommended. I got a good deal. What Derek didn't know, what I didn't know at the time either, was that a security system records everything, not just intruders. Everything. My name is James Walker, 64 years old, retired civil engineer, 31 years married to Sandra, who is 62, and teaches part-time at Portland Community College and makes excellent pot roast. And had, as I would discover on a Wednesday morning in October, been conducting an affair with our daughter's husband for what the camera timestamps would eventually confirm was at least 11 months. 11 months. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 11 months. That's Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, our anniversary in February, Sandra's birthday in April, our daughter Megan's birthday in June. 11 months of family dinners where I poured wine for a man who was sleeping with my wife. 11 months of Sunday phone calls where Derek asked how my back was holding up and whether I'd seen the Blazers game. I had not seen the Blazers game. I was too busy trusting people. I found out the way men usually find out. Not through genius detective work, not through a dramatic confrontation. I found out because someone got careless. It was a Wednesday morning, October 2nd, 6:14 a.m. Sandra had left for an early faculty meeting. She'd mentioned it the night before, kissed me on the cheek, taken her travel mug from the counter by the coffee maker. I was standing at the kitchen window in my robe, watching the birch trees in the backyard go gold, drinking the first cup. My phone buzzed. The security app. Motion detected. Back door. I almost ignored it. I had ignored 100 of them. Raccoons, the postal carrier, our neighbor's retriever who'd figured out our gate latch. But something about the timestamp made me look. 6:19 a.m. Sandra had left at 6:10. The motion was from inside the house, not outside. The camera covered the back hallway, angled toward the kitchen. I opened the app. Derek was in my kitchen. He hadn't knocked. He had a key. Sandra had given him one 2 years ago, she'd said, in case of emergencies, so he and Megan could get in if something happened to us. He was standing at the kitchen counter, in a jacket he hadn't been wearing when he arrived because his car wasn't in the front, which meant he'd parked somewhere else and walked, which meant this was not an accident or a spontaneous visit. He poured himself a cup of coffee from my coffee maker, he checked his phone, he sat down at my kitchen table, and then he waited. I stood at the window in my robe for 43 minutes, watching my phone screen, while the man my daughter married sat in my kitchen and waited for my wife to come back from the faculty meeting that I was now fairly certain did not exist. Here is something I learned about myself that morning. I'm not the kind of man who kicks indoors. I am the kind of man who makes a list. Sandra came back at 7:52. I watched them through the camera. I won't describe what I saw. I'll tell you only that it lasted 22 minutes and that when Derek left through the back door, he took his jacket and left the coffee mug in the sink without rinsing it. That detail bothered me almost as much as everything else. I didn't say a word when Sandra came home at noon. She came in through the front door with grocery bags and a story about a colleague named Pat who'd gone long in the meeting, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper, the actual printed newspaper, and I looked up and I said, "Good meeting?" "Long." She set the bags on the counter. "Pat cannot wrap up a discussion to save his life." Sounds frustrating. It is, every time. And that was that. She unpacked groceries. I read the newspaper, or appeared to. What I was actually doing was running the conversation I needed to have with my attorney through my head, organizing it, sequencing it, the way I used to organize a structural load calculation, methodically without emotion, because emotion introduces error. The attorney's name was Helen Morse, family law, downtown Portland, office on Southwest Broadway. I'd never needed her before. I found her through my accountant, a steady man named Paul Garrett who had done my taxes for 16 years, and who picked up the phone on the first ring when I called him from my car that afternoon and said very quietly, "Paul, I need a family law attorney today." Paul didn't ask questions. He texted me Helen's number before I reached the end of the block. I didn't know yet how many things were about to become relevant. I didn't know yet what Megan would say, and I absolutely did not know yet that Derek had made a financial decision 8 months earlier that was going to make the next conversation with Helen Morse considerably more interesting.
Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these accounts had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and subscribe. You're going to love it here.
Helen Morse was 58, had done family law in Portland for 24 years, and had the specific, unhurried manner of a woman who had seen every variation of human disappointment, and was therefore not rattled by any of them. Her office smelled like good coffee and paper files, and the reliable competence of someone who had never once in her career been caught unprepared. She looked at the screenshots I'd pulled from the security app, 4 of them time-stamped, and then she looked at me. "How long has this been going on?" The camera timestamps show the first incident in November of last year. That's as far back as the cloud storage goes. November. She wrote something down. "How are you?" "I'm organized," I said. She looked up. "That's a good answer. I spent 35 years calculating how much weight a structure could bear before it failed. I know what preparation looks like. I'd like to start preparing." She nodded. She pulled a yellow legal pad toward her, and for the next 2 hours, Helen Morse and I had the most productive conversation I'd had in recent memory. About the Irvington house, which was in both our names, about the retirement accounts, about the investment portfolio Paul Garrett managed, about the cabin in Bend I'd inherited from my father in 2018, and which was, I had thought, simply a family retreat, about Derek. "What do you know about his finances?" Helen asked. "He's a mortgage broker, good income. I've never looked at his specific numbers." "Has he ever borrowed money from you?" I paused. "He asked Sandra for a short-term loan last February," I said slowly. "She mentioned it in passing. Said it was a business thing. He was between deals." She said she'd lent him $12,000. Helen's pen stopped. "From which account?" I looked at her. "I'd have to check." "Check tonight," she said. "And James, don't tell Sandra you've checked. Don't tell anyone. Not yet." I drove home, made dinner, ate across from my wife of 31 years and talked about whether the birch trees in the backyard needed trimming before winter. After Sandra went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and looked at the joint savings account for the first time in 8 months. The $12,000 was there in February. That was accurate. What was not accurate was the figure Sandra had given me. Because the account history showed not 1 withdrawal, it showed 4. February, March, May, and August. Combined total, $31,000. The last withdrawal had cleared 6 days before my mother's funeral. The weekend I was 3 states away in Eugene. The weekend Sandra had stayed home because she said she wasn't feeling well. 47 texts from Derek's number on her phone that weekend. I knew because I'd seen the bill 2 weeks later and hadn't registered what it meant until now. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The birch trees could wait. There is a concept in structural engineering called load path. It describes how weight moves through a building, from roof to wall to foundation. When you understand the load path, you know which elements are truly bearing the structure and which ones are decorative. You know what you can remove without consequence and what, if removed, brings everything down. Sandra and Derek had been operating as though I was decorative. They were about to find out I was load-bearing. Thursday morning, October 3rd. Helen Morse called at 8:15. I was already at the kitchen table with coffee, having slept approximately 3 hours, having spent the remainder of the night reviewing 6 months of account statements. With the patient focus of a man who had spent a career reading documents that, if misread, caused buildings to fall. "The $31,000, Helen said. Did you find any documentation, loan agreement, acknowledgement, anything in writing?" "Nothing." "Then it's a marital asset that was transferred without your knowledge or consent. That's relevant to the division of marital assets, particularly if Derek can't account for it." "He won't be able to account for it," I said. "I know what it was for." A pause. "Tell me." "He had a licensing issue last spring. A complaint filed against his mortgage broker's license with the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation. I found the public record last night. It was filed in January, resolved in September. The complaint involved improper handling of a client's escrow funds. Not criminal, but regulatory." The kind of thing you'd need to resolve quickly and quietly before it affected your business. Helen was quiet for a moment. He used Sandra to access your joint savings to resolve a regulatory complaint. That's what I believe. And Sandra knew. Sandra knew. I heard her writing. James, I want you to understand what this means for the asset division. When a spouse uses marital funds without the other spouse's knowledge to benefit a third party, particularly a third party with whom they have an undisclosed relationship, Oregon courts take that seriously. We're not just looking at equitable division anymore. I understand. Do you want to proceed? Yes, I said. But I want to do one thing first. What's that? I want to make sure Megan hears about this from me. Not from Sandra, not from Derek, not from a divorce filing. From me. Helen paused. How old is Megan? 34. She's in Sacramento. She teaches high school biology. When are you going to call her? This weekend, after I have the documentation in order. She deserves the full picture, not a fragment. The weekend arrived slowly, the way difficult weekends do. Sandra was home Friday and Saturday, a normal weekend, or a performance of one, depending on your perspective. We went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning at the PSU Park blocks the way we had gone almost every Saturday for 20 years. She bought persimmons. I carried the bag. We ran into a couple from the neighborhood, the Hendersons, and stood on the sidewalk in the October sun and talked about their grandchildren for 12 minutes. I have never felt more like a man standing on hollow ground. Saturday afternoon, Sandra went to a yoga class. I went to Paul Garrett's office, which he'd opened specifically for me on a weekend because Paul Garrett is that kind of man. We spent 90 minutes reviewing the full financial picture, the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, the Irvington house, which had a current market value of approximately $780,000 against a mortgage balance of $94,000. The Bend cabin. The Bend cabin. The cabin is yours, Paul said, not for the first time. Inherited separately, never commingled. In Oregon, that's separate property. Sandra has no claim on it. I know. I just want to make sure it's at the front of your mind when you sit down with Helen. It is. Paul took off his reading glasses. He'd known me for 16 years. He looked at me the way people look at you when they've known you long enough to not need to ask how you are. You doing okay, James? I'm doing what needs to be done, I said. That's enough for right now. He nodded. He put his glasses back on. He printed the documents I needed.
If you've been listening for a while and want accounts like this to keep coming, it really helps when you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you.
Sunday. I called Megan at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon her time. She was home. I could hear the particular Sacramento Sunday quiet through the phone. Traffic faint in the background, her neighbor's dog. She picked up on the second ring. Dad, hey. Hey, sweetheart. I was sitting in the Bend cabin when I called her. I'd driven down Saturday night after Sandra fell asleep and slept in my father's old bed under the quilt my mother had made, and woken to the sound of the Deschutes River and the smell of pine and done what needed to be done. I need to tell you something. I need you to hear it from me before you hear it any other way. A pause, the specific pause of a child who has learned from experience that sentence precedes something that changes things. Okay, she said quietly. I told her, not everything at once. I'm not a man who buries people in information. I gave her the core of it, the part she needed first. I told her what I'd seen on the camera. I told her approximately how long it had appeared to be going on. I told her I was already working with an attorney, that her inheritance was protected, that her mother and I were going to be separating, and that this had nothing to do with her and everything to do with two adults who had made choices I was now responding to. She was quiet for a long time. Dad, I know. How long have you known? 5 days. And you sound, I'm okay. You sound like you're reading a building inspection report. I almost laughed. Almost. That's probably accurate. Dad. Her voice was different now. Not the shock anymore. Something deeper. Sadder. I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Always. Did you ever suspect before this week? I thought about it. Really thought. The way you think when the answer is going to cost you something. No, I said, and I've been trying to figure out what that means about me. "It doesn't mean anything about you," Megan said. "It means something about them." She was right. She has always been the clearest thinker in our family, her mother's organizational skills, her grandfather's precision. I sat in the Bend cabin and felt for the first time since Wednesday morning something that wasn't the cold arithmetic of documentation, something that simply hurt, plainly and without structure. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. What happens now?" "Now I go home," I said, "and I finish what I started." I didn't know yet what Derek was going to do when he found out the filing had been initiated. I didn't know yet that his response would be exactly the wrong one. The panicked, self-incriminating response of a man who had never once prepared for the possibility that he would be caught. And I absolutely did not know yet that Sandra, who had spent 31 years watching me work through difficult problems methodically and without noise, would make the mistake of underestimating me one final time. She would call Helen Morse's office on a Monday morning to propose a settlement. Helen Morse would call me, and I would say two words that ended the negotiation before it began. "Show her." Helen Morse had a policy against speakerphone during settlement discussions. She said it changed the dynamic, made people perform rather than negotiate. She made an exception on the Monday morning Sandra's attorney called. I sat in Helen's office on Southwest Broadway, in one of the two client chairs facing her desk, and I listened. Sandra's attorney was a man named Gary Fitch, competent, measured, the kind of voice that suggests he had done this many times and preferred the quick resolution. He opened by acknowledging that the situation was, and I am quoting, "complex and emotional for all parties," and that his client was prepared to be reasonable. Helen let him finish. Then she said, very pleasantly, "I'd like to share some documentation with you before we discuss terms." The documentation was 47 pages. Paul Garrett had compiled it. It included the 4 unauthorized withdrawals from the joint savings account, the timeline correlated against Derek's regulatory complaint filing dates, the cloud-stored security footage log, not the footage itself, just the metadata, timestamps, duration, frequency, 11 months of entries. The most recent one had been 2 days before this phone call. There was a pause on Gary Fitch's end that lasted approximately 9 seconds. "I'll need to consult with my client," he said. "Of course," Helen said. "Take the time you need." She ended the call, looked at me. 9 seconds, I said. "That's longer than I expected." What followed was not dramatic in the way people expect these things to be dramatic. There were no screaming phone calls, no ambush at the family home, no confrontation in a parking lot. What there was, instead, was 14 days of back and forth between two sets of attorneys, conducted in offices and over email, while Sandra and I continued to live in the Irvington house, in what I can only describe as the most precisely civil arrangement I have ever been part of. We said good morning, we cooked separate meals, we watched different televisions in different rooms. We were polite in the way of two people who understand that whatever they say to each other at this point is potentially relevant to the proceeding. I am a structural engineer. I understand load-bearing elements. I had become, in those 14 days, the most load-bearing thing in my own life. Derek's response, as I mentioned, was the wrong one. When Megan called him, not to accuse, just to say she knew and that she needed time, he panicked. He called Sandra from his car, not knowing that Sandra was sitting in Helen Morse's office reviewing the documentation for the 3rd time, and he said several things on that call that Sandra, to her attorney's visible distress, had already allowed to go to voicemail on a phone that was now being treated as a legal instrument. Men who panic leave evidence. Men who prepare do not need to. Derek's voicemail contained an acknowledgement of the relationship, a reference to the money, and an attempt to establish a shared story. That by the time he left the message, Sandra had already declined to corroborate because Helen had made very clear to Gary Fitch what the documentation showed and what it meant for any contested proceeding. Sandra did not protect him. I want to be precise about this, not because it gives me satisfaction, but because it is relevant to what actually happened. When the choice was between protecting Derek and protecting herself, Sandra chose herself. Quickly, without visible hesitation. I found I wasn't surprised.
If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people listen without ever doing it. It costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. Now, where were we?
The settlement was finalized on a Friday in late October. The Irvington house was to be sold, proceeds split equitably, with an adjustment for the $31,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, which the court treated as a marital waste claim. Helen had been right about that. Oregon courts take it seriously. The retirement accounts were divided per standard equitable distribution, with adjustments calculated by Paul Garrett that took into account the income differential. Over the last 12 years since Sandra had moved to part-time work, the Bend cabin was not on the table. It had never been on the table. Sandra's attorney raised it once, in the second week, and Helen's response was a single document: my father's death certificate, the probate filing, the inheritance record. And Gary Fitch moved on. Sandra moved into an apartment in the Pearl District. I stayed in the Irvington house through the listing process. I spent those weeks going through 31 years of accumulated belongings, with the careful, methodical attention of a man who has learned not to keep things that don't carry weight. Derek lost the mortgage broker's license. Not immediately. The regulatory process has its own timeline, its own pace. But the complaint that had been filed in January, the one he'd used $31,000 of my money to quietly manage, had not fully resolved in the way he'd believed. A subsequent audit, triggered by the civil proceedings discovery process, identified additional irregularities. His license was suspended pending review in early November. I did not engineer this. I want to be clear about that. I answered questions honestly when my attorney asked them, and provided documentation accurately when it was requested. What the process found, it found on its own. That is what honest documentation does. It tells the truth, and the truth has a way of being thorough. Megan filed for divorce in the second week of November. She called me the evening she signed the papers. We talked for a long time, about Derek, about her mother, about the particular grief of finding out that a chapter of your life was built on something that wasn't what you thought. She is the clearest thinker I know, and she was thinking clearly even then. "How are you doing, Dad?" "Better," I said. "Actually better. Not performed better." "I know the difference." "I know you do." "The cabin," she said. "Can we go before the snow?" "I'll check the calendar," I said. "Come up whenever you're ready. The key's in the same place it's always been." I've been thinking about what it means to build things. 35 years of civil engineering, and the thing that stays with me, the thing I keep coming back to now in the evenings at the Bend cabin with the river sound through the window, is the concept of the hidden load. In structural work, the most important forces in a building are the ones you cannot see. They're in the walls, the connections, the foundation. They don't announce themselves. They don't perform. They simply hold. People misunderstand what strength looks like in a crisis. They expect noise, volume, the dramatic confrontation in the driveway, the speech. What they don't expect is a man who sits at a kitchen table at 6 in the morning, watches a security camera feed on his phone, and then makes coffee. Who goes to the farmer's market on Saturday and carries the bag. Who calls his accountant on a Sunday and his daughter from a cabin and his attorney from a parking lot, and conducts the most important weeks of his life in the register of a building inspection rather than a house fire. Here is the thing about staying calm that most people don't understand. It is not the absence of feeling. I want to be precise about this. When I watched that camera feed on a Wednesday morning in October, I felt everything. The specific devastation of 31 years recontextualized in 60 seconds. The particular weight of understanding that someone you trusted had been operating in a parallel version of your life. I felt all of it. What I chose, and it was a choice made deliberately in the 43 minutes I stood at that kitchen window, was not to let the feeling drive the action. Because feeling-driven action is loud and expensive, and usually benefits the person who caused the feeling, not the person experiencing it. They want you to explode. They're prepared for explosion. They've been managing your potential explosion in their minds for months, planning around it, accounting for it. They are never prepared for documentation. There is a lesson inside this story that has nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with structure. The people who wronged me had been building something for 11 months, a parallel arrangement, carefully managed, they thought, invisible. But they had built it entirely on the assumption that I was not paying attention, that I was decorative, that my presence in the structure was assumed rather than load-bearing. They confused my quietness with vacancy, my calm with ignorance, my trust with weakness. I have spent a career understanding what holds things up. I have spent 35 years looking at structures other people designed and finding the places where the assumptions were wrong. And the load was going somewhere nobody planned for. I know what it looks like when a system is bearing more than it was designed to bear. I know the specific, particular signs that something is about to fail. What I did not do, when I found out, was become another unstable element in an already unstable system. What I did was what engineers do. I assessed, I documented, I consulted the right professionals, I made a plan. I executed the plan in sequence, without improvisation, without noise. The cabin in Bend was mine. It will remain mine. Megan will come up before the snow and will sit on the porch above the Deschutes in the specific October light. That makes everything in Central Oregon look like it was designed to last, and we will not talk about Sandra or Derek or the 47 text messages. or the $31,000, or the security camera, or Gary Fitch's 9-second pause on a speakerphone in a law office on Southwest Broadway. We will talk about the river, we'll talk about what she's teaching her students this semester, we'll make something for dinner and eat it without performing anything for anyone. A man who has been carrying a hidden load for 31 years is lighter, afterward, than you might expect. Lighter and clearer, and considerably more certain about what is actually worth holding up. Sandra had 31 years of my reliability, and chose to treat it as furniture. Derek had 4 years of my trust and used it as cover. They both learned the same thing, in the end, that every poorly designed structure eventually teaches the people inside it. The elements you ignore are the ones that determine whether the whole thing stands. I didn't yell, I didn't shout, I didn't send the text I could have sent, or make the call I could have made, or show up where I could have shown up. I just waited. And then I let the load do what load always does when the structure underneath it finally shifts. It found the floor,